We begin today's show with the Ukrainian Embassy in Ireland, which is expressing what it describes as serious concern about the exports of alumina from the Aughinish Refinery on the Shannon Estuary to Russia. The controversy centres on claims that alumina produced at the Russian-owned plant in County Limerick could ultimately be ending up in supply chains linked to Russia's military-industrial complex. The company insists it's fully compliant with all EU sanctions and trade regulations, while the government's launched an investigation and says it is awaiting the findings before any decisions are made. The issue, though, raises difficult questions about sanctions, European energy and industrial security, Ireland's support for Ukraine and the future of one of the country's most significant manufacturing employers. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by the Fianna Fáil MEP for Ireland South, Billy Kelleher, and also with us is the Newmarket and Fergus native and Professor of Politics at Dublin City University, Donncha O'Bacon. And Billy, the Ukrainian Embassy says it's deeply concerned that the alumina exported from Ireland may ultimately be supporting Russia's military-industrial complex. What's your reaction to those concerns?
Well, I mean, if alumina from anywhere was ending up in the military-industrial complex of Russia and being used to directly attack Ukraine, well, then clearly there would be huge concerns. And that's why, there's an investigation being launched by the Department of Enterprise Trade to look at this. The company has stated quite clearly that they're in compliance, but we also have to acknowledge that sanctions are decided by the European Commission, not by Ireland or by any other member state as an individual. It's a collective decision of the European Commission presented to the Council, and then the sanctions are enforced. And they have looked at alumina previously, and they have not sanctioned alumina. And of course, that's because it is strategically important to Europe as well. And we do know that large volumes of the alumina have been going to Dunkirk and Sweden and elsewhere to be converted into aluminium for the European industry as well. So they have looked at all of these things, but clearly looked at a continual round of sanctions coming on stream on a regular basis. They review all these things regularly, but to date, alumina has not been sanctioned by the European Union, and they have the competence on that. But clearly, the department's having an investigation, and they're looking at that. The company will be cooperating, but there would be genuine concerns, of course, if it was facilitating Russian aggression and military action in Ukraine.
And in terms of genuine concerns, I'm sure you're aware that the Irish Times, an organised crime and corruption reporting project from 3 months ago, which highlights claims that Aughinish alumina is exported in large quantities to Russia, where it's smelted and used in producing weapons that are deployed on the Ukrainian front line. Some of its key findings is that Aughinish alumina has increased its exports to Russian smelters since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that once it's in Russia, the alumina is processed into aluminium and sold to clients that include a Moscow-based trader which has supplied hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aluminium to Russian arms manufacturers. These arms manufacturers include more than 40 firms that have been sanctioned by the EU and whose weapons have killed thousands of civilians and caused widespread damage in Ukraine. And despite the European Union's calls for member states to stockpile alumina due to its importance in industry and defence, the bloc hasn't placed restrictions on the raw materials export to Russia. What do you make of those findings?
Well, I mean, they're statements by organisations that are carrying out investigations, and I mean, if they were to be factually the case, well, then that would be clearly of huge concern. But the issue here is that the European Union has, great capacity in terms of assessing what impact sanctions would have, both in Russia, but also if you have sanctions, what impact they may have on Europe as well. And one of the first principles of a sanction is that it should hurt the enemy more than it hurts yourself. And clearly, they have taken a decision around the issue of alumina that it is not to be sanctioned at the moment. Those things can change, and it's continually evolving. We're on round 22 now of sanctions against Russia. I met with President von der Leyen on Tuesday. We had a meeting with her, and the sanctions are having a deep impact now on the Russian economy. It is very much just a wartime economy, and it is beginning to struggle greatly in key areas. But let's be honest, while Europe is sanctioning, we still have the problem that China is pretty much facilitating Russia's survival in the context of supports into Russia, both financial and technological as well.
And look, I want to bring Donncha in now. That may well be the case, but if the findings in the Irish Times and Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project are fact, then we're kind of helping support what they're doing on the front lines in Ukraine as well. Donncha, go back on. How significant is it that Ukraine has publicly raised this issue with Ireland? And even if Aughinish is complying with EU law, does it create a moral and political dilemma for us?
Well, good morning, Alan. Good morning, Billy. It is concerning. I mean, the EU sanctions envoy, David O'Sullivan, has said it in those very words, very concerning. He's echoing the words of the Ukrainian Embassy. I think we have to ask ourselves the question, why does so much of the alumina go to Russia? And the simplest explanation is ownership. Aughinish is not an independent Irish company which is seeking to sell its goods to the highest bidder on the global market. It's part of Rusgals, which is, of course, a Russian company. It's part of its kind of vertically integrated business model. And therefore, it doesn't merely sell alumina wherever demand exists. It exists partly to supply Rusal's own smelters in Russia. Now, there has been a spike in the supply of alumina since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That, of course, has raised eyebrows because alumina can be used, of course, for civilian purposes, but it has an integral role also in military purposes. And it was for that very reason that Australia banned the export of alumina to Russia in March 2022 as a direct response to Russia's full-scale invasion, because, in the words of its prime minister, it played a critical role in Russia's war machine. Now, Australia at the time supplied 20% of Russia's entire alumina supply. So, of course, they had to, redirect their restructure their global supply chain. And that's where Aughinish came into the picture. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see the spike in exports from Aughinish to Russia post the full-scale invasion. But we have to ask ourselves the question, if it was the view of the Australians, and I think we can say the Australians are bad faith actors, they are our allies, they are, you might say, like-minded democracy. If it was their view that the alumina that they were exporting to Russia was being used in Russia's war machine for missiles, for drones, for killing civilians in Ukraine, we have to ask ourselves, why has the EU allowed this loophole to develop? I think there is a suspicion that, there has been pressure both from the company and perhaps maybe from the Irish government communicating to the European Union that this is not something that should be prioritised for sanctions because of the, economic implications. But it should be said that, if we are to take the revised figures, because there has been some discussion about what percentage of the Aughinish plant exports go to Russia. It was first coming out as 83%. I heard in the last couple of days the government saying that the Central Statistics Office data was incorrect, that it was actually something more like 45%.
Yeah, that was Minister Peter Burke was raising concerns or claiming that the figures provided to the Central Statistics Office were inaccurate.
Yeah, so look, nobody wants, the people who are working in Aughinish and those related companies to be unemployed. I don't think it's a binary choice. I think it's a matter of looking for, a reduction of exports to the point of elimination to Russia. This is the issue. It's not the creation of alumina. It's where it's being exported to and for what purpose. You could have the restructuring of ownership. That's what they did in Australia, in case you're wondering. That alumina plant in Australia is still open. It's still working at 100% capacity. So it's not a matter of we have to close Aughinish if we say that you can't export alumina to Russia. The problem is where it's been exported to. You could simply find alternative markets. If it is as important to the European market and to the global market as politicians suggest, then it shouldn't be difficult to find alternative customers.
Yeah, let me put that to you, Billy. What do you make of what Australia has done and why we here in Europe haven't been able to do that? And as Donncha said, ministers have warned sanctions could create a significant alumina supply problem for Europe. How serious is that risk? Donncha says if the work is put in, it shouldn't be too problematic to find alternative solutions.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is that Europe decides the sanctions, and the reason I say that it is important. I mean, I do not believe that Europe would be making a decision based on, whether or not they would sanction a product or based on employment in one part of the European Union. They will be looking at it primarily in the impact it would have on the Russian economy, and equally the potential impact it would have on the European economy. So I don't believe that they would look at sanctions and say, well, we can't sanction a product or an export line based on the potential job losses in one part of the European Union. The bottom line here is Russia has invaded Ukraine. It is putting huge political instability, financial pressures on Ukraine, and the European Union has provided a 90 billion loan to Ukraine for it to continue to fund itself both militarily and from a public administrative perspective. So those things are being done. And the idea then that we would, at the same time, facilitate, advancing the Russian economy elsewhere, in my view, they wouldn't do that. But they're obviously looking at alumina from a strategic perspective in the context of availability to Europe as well.
Can I ask you, Billy, the sanctions regime in Europe, with the EU, would you have any concerns that it loses credibility if products originating in the EU can still find their way into Russian military supply chains? And, that it's not a good look. That I take on board you're saying the amount of money and support that's been put in to helping Ukraine by the European Union. But, you tally that up with what is potentially happening here with alumina coming from Ireland being ultimately used in the production of weapons that are deployed to kill Ukrainians.
Well, obviously, if it's going to the military-industrial complex, that would be of great concern. I mean, I said at the outset, the Ukrainian Embassy has raised this issue, and, everybody that is supportive of Ukraine would find that very, very difficult to accept. But, the assurances that it's in compliance with EU obligations have been given, and we are now, there's an investigation being carried out to ascertain whether those are the facts or not. On the issue of divergence of statistics, there is, I think, a revision as to how much alumina is going to Russia vis-a-vis the European Union. I really wanted to get to the bottom of that as to how much is actually going to Russia. Was the spike as outlined by Donica because of Australia banning the export of bauxite and alumina to Russia? But at the same time, Russia is a net exporter of aluminium. I mean, the final product from alumina is aluminium, and it's a net exporter. It exports quite a substantial amount of aluminium outside of Russia, even now with the war ongoing. So, I mean, these are issues that will obviously have to be looked at in the broader context if we want to try and squeeze the Russian economy. And as I said, I spoke with Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission. She was quite clear that they are looking at sanctions on a continual basis to try and inflict damage on the Russian economy as much as possible to undermine its capacity to fund and promote the war in Ukraine.
Donica, the European Commission, as we discussed it recently, decided not to include Aughinish Alumina in its latest sanctions package. But there's clearly unease at European level over all this. Nearly 40 MEPs called for action against the plant. Does that suggest that unease within Europe is growing about loopholes or unintended consequences in the sanctions regime?
It does. And, we do get assurances that, Billy referred to them, that, this material is not being used for military purposes. But I imagine those assurances are coming from the company themselves in the first instance. And we have to stress again that this is a Russian company. The majority of directors are Russian, and that's why its market is predominantly Russian. There's no, logic in a way that, the majority of Irish alumina exports would not be going to other parts of the EU, that they would be going far away to Russia. Other than that, it's a Russian company. So, there has been now, yes, increased scrutiny of this in the EU. It hasn't yet, I think, reached a critical mass. I mean, it was mentioned by the Vice President, EU Vice President, I think 39 MEPs from 12 different countries. That's not approaching anything close to a majority. But I think, because of the fact that we have seen now in recent months, again, increased attacks on Ukraine. Of course, the summer is coming, which I think will mean more movement on the battlefield as well. I think closing those loopholes and being consistent, I think this is what the EU has to do. And Ireland is not alone in this, by the way. I mean, there are other European countries who are still bizarrely supplying Russia with dual-use technologies or importing fossil fuels. That still exists. And so we are, giving Ukraine support on the one hand, but we're also giving financial, support to their tormentors.
And Donncha, the government's going to conduct its own review before advocating any change at EU level. As Billy said earlier, that's where the real change will happen, if any. But how much heed do you think will be paid at national level or European level to that report I mentioned earlier on from the Irish Times and the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project? It looks like a fairly thorough investigation, and I mentioned some of the key findings. It's pretty compelling.
This is the March report, yes?
Yes.
Yes. No, it did seem rather compelling. And, but we're 2 months into that now, 3 months almost. And only now, 4.5 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, did we hear about a review of what's going on in Aughinish. And you have to ask yourself why there wasn't an investigation or review of this before, when the Australians, as I said, acted so swiftly. And I think the conclusion is that simply people didn't want to perhaps find out as much as maybe needed to be found out. I think that's the big problem thus far. The optics are damaging. I mean, there's no question there. I mean, every missile strike on Ukrainian cities, I think, it will increase political pressure on European governments to eliminate economic links like this that benefit Russia.
Billy, the investigation from the government, Minister Burke says his department's conducting a deep dive investigation. How quickly should the investigation be completed, given the international attention the issue is attracting, and should the findings of the review be made fully public?
Well, look, they should be thorough in the first place, and obviously they should be as quick as is possible when you're trying to, ascertain statistics coming from Russia as well. Obviously, it have to be really, really analysed in great detail to ensure their veracity and fact. And we have to accept those realities as well. But I mean, the department will have to come forward, in my view, soon, because this is creating, as I say, reputational issues. And reputational issues for Europe as well. I mean, at the end of the day, it is the European Union will decide. We do not unilaterally impose sanctions on Russia, but so that we can actually know fully how much is being exported to the European Union, how much is being exported to Russia, and where it ends up from a Russian perspective in terms of its use. Is it for civilian purposes? Is it for dual use? Or does it actually end up in the military-industrial complex? And if that is the case, well, then that is a very serious issue.
Okay, we will leave it there, but my thanks to both of you for joining us. That's the Fianna Fáil Ireland South MEP Billy Keller, and also Professor of Comparative Politics at DCU, the American Fergus native, Donncha O'Bacon. Thank you as always for joining us as well.